From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Library of Congress and a special day of discussion about women mapping the world. I'm Helena Zinkham, Director for Collections and Services here at the library, and on behalf of the Librarian of Congress, we are honored to co-host this important conference with the Society of Women Geographers. You have done so much to add to the growth of knowledge in many varied and allied disciplines. And the growth of knowledge is, in fact, a mission for the Library of Congress, too, isn't it? Founded in 1800, we are not only the oldest federal cultural institution in the United States, but the largest library in the world. Pretty bold statement, right? But as it happens, we have more than 158 million items in our collections in more than 470 different languages. We are constantly acquiring and preserving new information resources, and we also strive very hard to make sure that the collections are well used to create new knowledge and spark new ideas. Our long relationship with the Society of Women Geographers began with Clara Laguerre. Is anyone in the room, you knew her? Oh, a few hands are going up. How long did she work at the library? Forever. Well, the wonderful Geography and Map Division let me know 70 years. And she was, of course, also a leader in your organization, the Society of Women Geographers. But I'm also pleased to note that our manuscript division is holding the papers of many of your distinguished members. For example, the anthropologist, Margaret Mead, and the oceanographer as well as cartographer, Marie Tharp. I'm also chief of the Prints and Photographs Division, so I've been fond of your organization through the work of Frances Carpenter. Not perhaps the same level of household name, but Frances, with her father Frank, in the early 1900s compiled one of the most actively used photo collections in the Library of Congress, Carpenter Collection. They were creating travel guide publications, and the photographs that they collected throughout the world have been invaluable for that era. One more question. How many of you are already frequent users of the library's collections? Or is it, okay, a few hands are going up. First-timers today? Oh, also wonderful. So you can guess what comes next. My job is to encourage all of you to come back, visit us in person or online often, because the Geography and Map Division, I think we can safely say one of the best map collections in the whole world. They are one of our leaders in putting more and more maps online. So even if you think you know what the Geography and Map Division has, keep checking back. And in closing, I congratulate your planning committee on developing an engaging program of topics and speakers, one that should generate much discussion on national as well as global mapping and the important role that women have played in those fields. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mary Finn Balgoy. I'm the Executive Director of the Society of Women Geographers. I want to welcome you to this event called Women Mapping the World. We have two things that are going on. We have today the conference and tomorrow the tours. So if you are signed up for the tour, please see me after the, during the day, let me put it that way, because we will be meeting at a certain place in a certain time, and we're going to have a great tour of the map collections themselves. Just as Helena was saying, it's a big collection. You wouldn't imagine it. I went on a tour, and it's fantastic. So if you haven't signed up for it and want to go, please let me know as well. Well, I'm honored to be here today to have really worked with the Library of Congress on this particular conference and to have an exciting lineup of speakers. We have speakers not only from the Society of Women Geographers, which was founded in 1925, but we also have people from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, as well as our, just regular LOC people as well that work in the cartography departments. So I'd like to welcome you, and I would like to, first of all, welcome Lawrence Ayers and Katie Smith up to the podium here as our first speakers for today. And this is the evolution of mapping. Now I have to put on my reading glasses. Lawrence Ayers has been in a leadership role in the geospatial domestic and international world through the great technological expansion of the past 60 years. GIS World identified him in 1995 as one of the 10 most influential people in the world in GIS. Larry projected at the time that GIS would mature from islands of automation into a major segment of the information industry and become essential in everyday life, and it certainly has. He credited his success to being part of the great geospatial technology expansion with the visionary and motivated men and women who make up the field. Larry?
Well, it's an honor to be here, and the greatest part is to look out and see faces that my career over those many years has had an opportunity to interact with and enjoy working with you. The history of mapping is kind of daunting, but interesting. And I think Katie is going to give you a great tour through it this morning. When I think about the history of mapping, there are three things, being a person that loves history, that I've enjoyed. One is maps over history really captures the historical events of our society. If you think about it, go back to the Romans and all the way up to the present, the maps captured it. Secondly, it being a career in military mapping, knowledge of the battlefield or the battle area was considered a force multiplier. Think about that. I'll give you two examples. George Washington, when he was in Boston, and he put some 17 or 18 cannons up on Dorchester Heights, and General Howe walked out and looked up and saw them. He boxed up his 14,000 troops and took the British Navy and retreated out of the harbor without a shot being fired. And the second that comes to mind, if your Civil War, is Andrew Jackson knew the Valley of Virginia. He had a topographer that made sketches for him. And he had an army of 4,000. And he ran around Massanutten Mountain hitting 3 different armies, Union armies. And the report was, the total of those armies was 30,000. But he reported back to Lincoln that Jackson had 50,000 troops hitting him, force multiplier. And the third area, which is more appropriate to this, is new hostilities tend to stimulate new technology adaptations. Examples, the drones, terminal guidance, and the real-time delivering of spatial information to the field. Katie Smith has a remarkable career through her advancements through mapping technology. This young girl leaving Davenport, Iowa. I won't tell the year that you did. But she reported in to the Chart Center, ACIC, Aeronautical Chart and Information Center, and went through the Carter School. She was so good that after she got out and worked a little bit as a young cartographer, they brought her back as a professor or an instructor to teach geodesy because they were running classes very rapidly to build up the force. I remember when I was there, we took anyone that had at least 24 hours of math and science up through differential equations, and then we'd teach them the mapping. Katie was there, and then she left and followed her husband for 8 years in his career. But she returned to DMA in '77 at the Hydrotopo Center and really began to make her mark. She started as a production cartographer, but she was selected for long-term training and got a degree or a master's in engineering and photogrammetry and remote sensing from Virginia Tech in '81. Then in '88, she couldn't seem to hold the job very well because they sent her back to St. Louis. And she headed up the ADP in communication in geodesy and geophysics. This was the whole era of what was known as mobile missiles. The missile force really had to have the geophysical data to hit their targets, both the submarine mobile launches, and at that time they were considering putting them on rail cars and moving them around. The Russians actually were doing that. So Katie was right there in the middle of the heat of trying to get the geodetic and geophysical information ready for those systems. She then directed the mapping and digital delivery of the information to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. I think many of you may remember that. That was quite a feat and really the beginning of a new era. In 1992, she left St. Louis and came back to Washington. Second round. Your furniture must have been beat up by that.
Something like 15 moves over the years with the Army.
And she created the online direct information for geophysical data. This was kind of heady stuff when you started thinking about putting data out online to the troops in the field. And she continued that up through the Bosnian conflict. Katie also did something. She created a new field, professional field, which more encompassed the technologies. It was called Imagery and Geospatial Occupation Career. And she became the chairman of that occupational council. Katie has received many awards, but I think they all culminated in the year 2010 when Katie was inducted into the NGA Hall of Fame. Katie, we're ready for a trip through history.
Thank you, Larry. Do I have my clicker? Ah, there's the man with my clicker. Good man. What I propose to do this morning is to quickly take you through almost 3,000 years of mapping technology. And I'm going to try to find some evidence of the involvement of women along the way. Now, I'm going to caution you, I'm going to be focusing on mapping itself and not so much on the exploitation of mapping data as through geographic information systems. But first of all, what is a map? Well, I'm going to use the traditional definition that a map is a graphic, two-dimensional representation of the Earth. The graphic aspect is key because of the power of graphics to express great amounts of complex information in a very intelligible way. You could take all the information on a simple road map and write it in text, but you'd end up with something that was almost like a book and nobody could figure out what it was. As to charts, well, as I was taught at the Aeronautical Chart and Information Center, a chart is more than just a map because a chart has navigational information. But why do we make maps? Well, I think that there is a basic human desire to understand our world and to be able to make our way around in it. There are some other really practical reasons why we have maps. There are political uses to establish control and boundaries. We use them to plan for economic development and document property ownership. As Larry emphasized, maps have always been important in warfare and conquest, and we use them for exploration and just for pleasure. And to me, that's one of the big things about maps, just the pure enjoyment of vicariously traveling to places that we haven't been before. Now, today, almost everybody has in their pocket a GPS-enabled smartphone that can easily display maps and spatially related information. You can not only find the restaurant that you want to go to and get directions for how to get there, but you can get the menu. But how did we get here? And how has mapping evolved over time? Well, the ancients had some of the emerging technologies that we will see through the centuries. They did some measuring of the earth, which is surveying. They worked on trying to define the size and the shape of the earth, which is our geodesy. They collected information about the earth, which is our geography, and of course, they worked a way to find their way around the earth. Now, we don't have any records of the first maps. They were probably something scratched in the dirt or the sand by either a hunter trying to show the good hunting grounds or by a woman showing where you could pick berries. Now, though it's generally believed that men were the first map makers, I don't think that this is necessarily the case. It is generally accepted that the oldest existing map that we have is this one from Babylonia, about the 5th century BC. If we look at the constructions of ancient civilizations, the Assyrians, the Persians, and other cultures, we know that they must certainly have had surveying techniques. The methods used by the Egyptians are pretty well understood. In China, we actually have some wood block print maps from the 4th century BC. But most of the advances in ancient mapping were made by the Greeks. One of the great figures in mapping history is Eratosthenes from the 3rd century BC. It had long been accepted that the earth was a sphere, at least going back to Aristotle in the 4th century BC. But Eratosthenes was the first person to use a mathematical method to determine the size of the earth. Now, he had some offsetting errors in his process, but his final estimate of about 24,000 miles is pretty accurate. He also created the first map of the world incorporating parallels and meridians and reflecting the knowledge of geography by the Romans in that time. Ptolemy was the second great figure in mapping. He came along in the 2nd century. His Geographica was a compilation of all that was known about the world at that time in the Roman arena. And he made the first map of the world incorporating parallels and meridians, and it was on a projection. Navigation was, of course, important in the ancient world. The ancient mariners used astronomical observations in sailing directions. Land routes were documented by itineraria or road maps. These kind of itineraria continued to be used in the medieval period by pilgrims and other travelers. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire, most of the ancient knowledge of mapping was lost in Europe. And as with other literate activities, what was carried on was done mostly in the monasteries and convents. The map making continued there, and it tended to focus on portraying religious views. But in the Arab world, mapping continued based on Ptolemy. World maps, or mappa mundi, as they were called, were produced throughout the medieval period. Common type of medieval map was what we would call an OT map, which was basically a circle with a T inscribed in it. They reflected the continents as known in the Roman period. Now, as the medieval period advanced, these mappa mundi became more complex, and they added things like cardinal directions, but would also have information brought by travelers, and they would illustrate religious stories and myths. The Ebstorf map shown here is a mappa mundi of the more complex kind. It was found in a convent in northern Germany. Now, the fact that we found maps in convents leads many to believe that women were indeed involved in some medieval mapping during this period. Marine navigation, of course, continued. Toward the end of the medieval period, portolan charts were made based on compass directions and estimated distances observed by the pilots at sea. They were first made in the 13th century in Italy, but later they were made in Spain and Portugal, which were the two great sea powers of the coming era. And they increased a great deal in accuracy. I will note that the chart that you see here is reputed to be the oldest original cartographic artifact in the Library of Congress. With the Renaissance, mapping, as in other disciplines, was characterized by the rediscovery of ancient knowledge. Particularly important was the translation and publication of the Geographica of Ptolemy. The great technological advantage of this era was printing, which had almost the effect, I would say, that the web has had on mapping, because it increased the accessibility and availability of maps. This happens to be one of my favorite objects. I first saw this many years ago in the Germanische National Museum in Nuremberg, Germany. It reflects the common idea of the globe in 1492 when it was made, and very much reflects Ptolemy's vision of the globe. And when you see it, you see why that estimate of 18,000 mile circumference might be one of the main reasons why Columbus thought he could easily reach India by sailing west. Now, the voyages of Columbus began the age of discovery, and it greatly expanded the European knowledge of the globe. We have here one of the earliest depictions of the voyages and discoveries of Columbus and early explorers. Now, during the 16th century, maps looked very different, and the results of the explorations became incorporated into the maps. Printing made maps much more readily available, and large family mapping houses were established as commercial enterprises. First in the Netherlands, and you see some of the family names here, and later in other European countries. We know for certain that women were involved in some of this map making, at least as colorists. But women would also, if they were widowed, take over the operations of their mapping houses. So I will also note that some of the most beautiful maps that we have happen to be from this period. Now, outside of Europe, advances continued to be made in mapping. An example is pre-race, the Ottoman cartographer, mariner, and admiral. He actually fought in the Battle of Lepanto. He produced his Book of Navigation in 1513. It contained a world map and detailed nautical atlas of the Mediterranean. I first discovered pre-race only in 2012 on the dock in Gallipoli, Turkey, where he was born. There is a monument and a museum to him there. I knew, of course, of Matthew Fontaine Murray, who was the great American oceanographer, but here we see a man who was doing similar kind of work, but in the 16th century. During the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, scientists shifted from the recovery of knowledge to innovation, and rigorous scientific mapping methods were developed. The 18th and 19th centuries were also the age of great national survey programs. France took the lead in the 18th century. The Carte de France comprises the first maps based on geodetic triangulation, and the project was based on the first systematic national survey. It was executed by the Cassini family, and it took more than 50 years to complete. The French were also active in efforts to measure the prime meridian. This was an effort to determine the true shape of the globe. Now, although people knew for a long time that, or believed for a long time, that the Earth was spherical, Newton proposed in 1687 that because of the Earth's rotation, that the globe was actually flattened at the poles. If this were true, the degrees of latitude would be shown to grow longer as you move toward the poles, and would confirm polar flattening, as eventually was actually done. I have to mention one other contribution to future mapping by the French in this period, and these were the mathematical developments of Pierre-Simon Laplace, which included the spherical harmonics by which we describe the Earth's geoid or gravity field today. In England, the National Ordnance Survey's roots go back to efforts to control the British clans after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745. The National Mapping Program was partly a response to Napoleon's threatened invasion in the 1800s. Now, among some of the most significant accomplishments in England was the development of an accurate method for measuring longitude. Although the ancients could measure latitude to a great degree of accuracy, to about a minute, longitude was a more difficult problem because it depends on having accurate timekeeping. This was particularly difficult at sea. John Harrison's marine chronometer was finally recognized by the British Parliament in 1773 as the solution to the longitude problem. And if you go to the Greenwich Observatory in London today, you can see Harrison's first 4 chronometers. Another English accomplishment of this era was the Great Trigonometry Survey of India, which was begun in 1802. This was a massive project. The accomplishments of the survey included the demarcation of the British territories in India and the measurement of the heights of Mount Everest and K2. Just imagine surveying the Himalayas. The survey had an enormous scientific impact. It was responsible for one of the first accurate measurements of a section of arc of longitude, and for the measurements of the geodesic or gravity anomalies. Now, in the US, the land survey system was proposed and supported by Thomas Jefferson. It was initiated by the Land Ordinance of 1785, when the federal government became responsible for all the lands to the west of the original 13 states. The government wanted to award soldiers of the Revolutionary War with land and also to make money by selling it. This was conducted by the Government Land Office and successor agencies over the following century. The survey was the first mathematically designed system and nationally conducted cadastral or real estate survey in a modern country. It was very influential around the world, and when you look at all of those rectangular plats out in the Midwest and the West, you are seeing the results of the public land survey system. Now, toward the latter part of the 19th century, you start to see the beginnings of some developments that will have a great impact on mapping in the 20th century. We, of course, have computer technology starting, and we have, of course, Lady Ada Lovelace, reputed to be the first computer programmer. We have some of the beginnings of geospatial analysis. John Snow famously found the source of the London cholera epidemic of 1854 by mapping the distribution of cholera cases around a pump. Usually this is considered a milestone in epidemiology, but I consider it a milestone in geospatial analysis. Charles Booth later published maps of poverty in London, marking the use of mapping for the understanding of social conditions. And Florence Kelly, an early woman in geospatial analysis, was responsible for the development of maps of household characteristics in Chicago. Then we come to Nader. Nader took the first aerial photograph. This was in France in 1858 from a tethered balloon. Now, we don't have any of Nader's original photographs left, so we have here the earliest known existing aerial photograph. It was taken over Boston in 1860 by James Wallace Black. The 20th century, we see an explosion of mapping technology. The development of aerial photography was one of the most significant advances in the history of map making. Until then, all the features that we captured for a map were basically captured by human beings drawing sketches. The observations were usually from the ground, although sometime you might be able to get a bird's eye view from the top of a hill or a steeple. With the advances in trigonometry, we were able to place the features more accurately, but it all involved a great deal of effort. With aerial photography, we could capture accurate two-dimensional views of the Earth. Techniques for tying survey data with aerial photography improved the completeness and accuracy of maps, and the use of stereo photographs and the development of photogrammetry provided the ability to accurately map in 3 dimensions. Now, much of the development of mapping technology in the 20th century was related to warfare, as Larry noted. It has always been true that mapping technology has been spurred by military considerations, but the military needs played a particularly large role in the 20th century. Now, in World War II, both sides used aerial reconnaissance, first from balloons and kites, and the Germans even used some dirigibles. In 1909, Wilbur Wright took the first photograph from an airplane with a handheld camera. The first aerial cameras were produced in Germany. By the time we were at the end of World War I, more advanced aircraft with airframe-mounted aerial cameras were operational on both sides. Also during World War I, photo interpretation became established as a discipline, and there were developments of simple photogrammetric map-making techniques for the military. By the end of the war, both sides made maps from photo mosaics, and some stereoscopic photos were being exploited. Now, although women were in many untraditional roles in World War I, it's hard to find much evidence of women actually involved in mapping. I do have this picture here of the British Ordnance Survey print room in World War I, and I think we might be able to see some evidence of women here. And then we have this all-woman survey crew in Idaho in 1918, which perhaps reflects the shortage of men for domestic mapping in the US during World War I. Now, between the wars, we don't have much evidence of women involved in mapping. And the main development in technology in that period was photogrammetry, and this was mostly done in Germany. Now, World War II saw not only advances in mapping technology, but the development of new sensors such as radar and sonar. And it was during World War I that women got the opportunity to get involved in mapping. And now for the usual reason, because there was a shortage of available men. In both the UK and the US, women served as photo interpreters. In Britain, women map makers were paid less than men. But as photo interpreters, they were considered the equal of men, and they were involved in the planning for many important operations, including the planning for D-Day. In the US during World War II, the Army Map Service hired large numbers of women to replace men. These women were named the military mapping maidens. We have here a picture of Bea McPherson, who joined as a mapping maiden in 1943. Bea is very much with us, and I had the pleasure of meeting Bea this past year when she was honored by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and its Alumni Association. During World War II, the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey also hired women to replace men lost to the armed forces. Women were placed in positions which formerly had been filled almost entirely by men, both in map making and in surveying parties in the field. Now, during and after the war, developments continued in photogrammetry. Analog stereoplotters used transparencies of photo to project the stereo model. Now, to create this model, you had to physically orient the photographs to recreate their orientation when the two photos were taken. All of this was done by hand. You have here a picture of a Kelch stereo plotter. This is actually the kind of plotter that I learned photogrammetry on. When you did large mapping projects, you had to actually tie together, large flight lines of aerial photographs. This was a very tedious project. You had to transfer geodetic control points to these photographs and then put on all of your tie points. This was done physically using metal or cardboard templates. I like this picture because it gives a good sense of the amount of work involved in doing aerial triangulation in this period. I also like it because there are a few women here, and I will note that I actually learned to do this. Oh, not fun. The space age resulted in more advances in mapping technology. The first American satellite was launched in 1958, a few months after the Russian Sputnik. Satellite technology then allowed the Earth to be measured from space, and it began the era of satellite geodesy. It was now possible to actually measure the distance between London and New York. The military needs of the Cold War drove much of the innovation of this period, as did the conflict in Vietnam. The Corona system, which was actually launched in 1960 and declassified in 1992, resulted in much of the mapping innovation of that era, and I will say the innovation in analytical photogrammetry. Now, analytical photogrammetry increased mapping capabilities. With analytical stereoplotters, we incorporate computers which do the work of mathematically aligning the images, no more manually doing your tip, tilt, and swing. We were also able, with computers, to accomplish the triangulation of both the aerial and satellite photography. No more having to lay metal. Now, with the Cold War and the beginning of the space age, we began to see a focus on more of a global perspective in mapping. It was also a period in which women gradually became more involved in mapping. Now, the World Geodetic System, to my mind, is one of the most important developments of the 20th century. The World Geodetic System consists of a reference ellipsoid and an Earth gravity model, and we express that gravity model in Monsieur Laplace's spherical harmonics. The World Geodetic System to me, as I said, was a major, major development, because before this time, all mapping was tied to either local or national datums. Now, Irene Fisher worked for the Army Map Service and was a pioneer in the development of the World Geodetic System. The Fisher ellipsoid of 1960 and its 1968 update were the basis for today's WGS 84, which was developed by the Department of Defense. Today, WGS is the standard coordinate framework for the entire planet. Without the World Geodetic System, the GPS on your phone wouldn't know where it was at. And on to GPS. Well, people had long used the stars to navigate, but now we have our own man-made constellation. Now, of course, the GPS is a space-based satellite navigation system that provides location and time information in all weather conditions. And all the locations are referenced to the World Geodetic System. It was initiated by the U.S. Department of Defense to support military navigation and became finally fully operational in 1995. In 1996, President Clinton declared that GPS was a dual-use system, which meant that data was no longer restricted to the military. Since then, GPS commercial applications have become ubiquitous. Now, the last frontier of mapping on the Earth is the ocean floor. Marie Tharp's efforts resulted in a systematic attempt to map the entire ocean floor, and her analysis of this data confirmed the theory of continental drift. In the 1990s, we began to see some women taking leadership roles in mapping. When I started my career with what is now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in 1964, and yes, Larry, I will admit that, there were few women in mapping, and none that I could see in leadership roles. But now that was changing, and you will be fortunate enough to meet some of these women later today. This era importantly saw the development of major digital mapping systems. Prominently among them was the digital production system developed by my old agency, the Defense Mapping Agency. The DPS was an end-to-end digital mapping system. And I will tell you, when we started this system, there was not much in terms of digital mapping out there. I worked on a project for the agency in the late 70s to determine the state of the art, and there wasn't much. But the roots of digital mapping go back much earlier. Now, of course, the U.S. launched Landsat in 1972, and this resulted in some of the first digital satellite imagery and some of the first digital mapping applications. The Census Bureau actually produced its digital Tiger files for the 1990 census, and the Defense Mapping Agency in 1992 released the Digital Chart of the World. Now, the Digital Chart of the World was notable because it was the first global digital map. It was produced by digitizing 1 to 1 million scale aeronautical charts in vector format. And its release generated a great deal of interest in the potential of digital maps. Now, some of the first digital mapping data produced by the Department of Defense was initially used to drive radar simulators for pilot training. The digital landmass system had two components: terrain elevation matrix data and feature analysis data. These represented some of the first efforts to create standard formats for digital mapping data. But as more operational uses for this data became important, there was a need for greater accuracy. Digital terrain elevation matrices are among the most useful forms of digital mapping data. They can be manipulated and used to perform analysis. But some of this first digital mapping data was produced before the introduction of the PC and capabilities to digitally display the data. Initially, this digital data was collected to be used to make paper maps. Only later was the data collected for digital terrain data. I will mention that since the February 2000 shuttle radar topography mission flew, we have now almost global coverage of digital terrain data. And this was a project joint between the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and NASA. Digital feature analysis data complemented the DTED data. Surface features such as vegetation, buildings, and infrastructure were stored as vector data, divided into point, line, and area features. This data could be queried and manipulated and displayed in many different ways, and has many advantages over raster maps, which are essentially digital pictures of maps. In the mid-1990s, technology began to make map data more accessible. Digital mapping technology had been advanced by the digital production system development, and more digital mapping products were being produced. The DPS development itself involved many contractor and government organizations who now continued the development of digital mapping technologies. I mentioned that DMA established its first web map distribution initiative in 1992, and the impetus was to try to make data more readily accessible for our military customers. But soon after that, commercial online mapping data began to be available. And at the same period, you started to see open GIS tools also online. Which brings us to today. When commercial applications of digital geospatial data and applications proliferate. Now, where are we going next? I will tell you that in 1964, when I began as a cartographer, I could have never dreamed the things that have happened over the last 50 years. It's been an amazing ride, an amazing experience. Where we will go in the next decades, we can only imagine, but it's still a big world out there. So thank you. Any questions? How long did I go? Oops. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay. Any questions? None? You drowning? Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about really early when, so we knew the world was round a long, long, long time ago. And then for a long time we just forgot. What?
Well, the people
how did the world is flat thing come about?
You have to realize we have people today who don't believe in global warming and still think there's a flat Earth. So there's always somebody who doesn't get the message. I think it was pretty well Aristotle, at least on record, who established that the Earth was spherical, and there were a lot of ways that they was looked at. One of the ways was the way ships would disappear over the horizon. You know, the bottoms first, the masts last. Also, the shape of the Earth's shadow on the moon. So, you know, the ancients really knew a lot about astronomy. Some of this was lost, as I say, after the fall of the Roman Empire, when there was a great loss in terms of the writings and documents, and of course, I guess we'd have to throw in there the Great Fire, the Library of Alexandria, when a lot of ancient knowledge was lost. But no, it was generally known by people who were knowledgeable that the Earth was spherical. It was not until we got to Newton who said, no, because of the angular momentum of the Earth's rotation, it must be flattened at the poles. And then, you know, I talked about the Great Survey of India. This was the first time they really started to be able to measure gravity anomalies. And of course, this is partly because you had a lot of them, because you have all that mass in the Himalayas. When we started to think in terms of the shape of the Earth as being a geoid, that it is not a regular ellipsoid, but it's a bumpy kind of thing. So, no, people generally knew that the Earth was spherical, although, like I say, not everyone got the word. Yeah, yeah, you first.
You touched on the Fisher list,
Yes.
which I'd never heard of.
Oh,
And I'm curious, I understand it doesn't have the same broad-based appeal of Tharp's oceanography and mapping of the ocean floor, but has anyone written on this?
oh. He asked about the Fisher ellipsoid, and he said it's the first he'd ever heard of it. And he, asked if anyone has written on it. There are things written on Irene Fisher, and she's been recognized, of course, by my old agency. But I think geodesy in general is one of those things that most people just, A, either haven't heard of, or B, don't really understand the significance of. The whole question of, well, why is this whole thing about, the size and shape of the Earth, and why does it matter that we know what the gravity field is just kind of hard for most people to grasp. And as someone who taught this at one time, it's tough sometimes for people to get their head around. But the bottom line is our ability to have those accurate GPS positions depends almost totally on having an accurate representation of the Earth. And that's what we started to get with some of the foundation work, with some of the work that Irene Fisher did. Very important. Yeah. I think you were next.
Most of the history that you've given us so far, the ancient history, is very Eurocentric. What
Yes.
do we know about what was happening in mapping in India, in China, and Japan?
There is some known. I think I very quickly mentioned some of the like 4th century BC Chinese woodblock map. There was mapping obviously going on in other places. It didn't tend to have the scientific or mathematical basis that the Greeks brought to it. The Greeks were really the first to bring a mathematical basis to mapping. But no, that's not very well studied, and I will admit it is an area where my knowledge is a bit thin, shall we say. Yes.
Thank you, by the way. It was very, very enlightening. There's a section in there that probably should be mentioned, because before we had GPS and before all the constellations got up there, because, a lot of us waited a long time before they got all those satellites up and working properly.
Yes, we did.
But we used dead reckoning.
Yep.
And I don't know so much whether land mapping uses that sort of thing, but I'm a navigator on charts, and we use dead reckoning a lot with very high and accurate inertial navigators, which is what all the submarines use still. Mm-hmm. They still have to come up, or they still have to come up with their updating their dead reckoning systems. And then we had Loran. Remember
Yes.
Loran? And
Oh, yes.
I mean, we lived for Loran and those satellites prior to the GPS satellites.
And that kind of approach is still very much what you saw way back when you saw those early Portolan charts. The chart that I said was the oldest artifact in the Library of Congress cartographic collection. It's very much working on the same principle, which is basically you measure your distances and you can, by other observations, measure your latitude at least. So yes, that kind of navigation continued to be used, into the 1990s.
And the other thing that was interesting is, because it took so long for the military to release, not degrade the GPS, degrading the GPS during that time period, that's when I guess the map makers decided the heck with it, and they went to kinematic and started bypassing and using mathematics to bypass the corrections that the Navy and the military were putting on them. And that's where our kinematic, which is, I would say, one of the most important things kinematic navigation still with GPS still exists. So.
No, I agree. And like I say, I didn't focus so much on navigation, but primarily on the map-making aspects. Yeah. Yeah. Mary?
I might modify your timeline on digital
Okay.
mapping, because in the late 70s, the CIA had the World Data Bank.
Yes.
And that was used extensively. Now, it went back to punch card days, and you had big plotters, but it was a worldwide data set of boundaries, rivers, roads at a scale of about 1 to 3 million, and was very, very used over that time.
Thank you very much, Katie.
Okay, thank you.
We are just going to take a short break, 10-minute break, regroup here at 10:15 so that we can go on with our next session.
And good morning. Sorry, I was a little tardy this morning. My name is Kim Cruz. I'm the past president of the Society of Women Geographers. And just to tell you a little bit more about the Society, we are an organization of women drawn together by our passion for learning and adventure. Our women come from diverse disciplines recognized in the arts, exploration, journalism, and even espionage. We have been to outer space, to the ocean floors, the tops of mountains, and to the poles of the earth. And we have mapped those areas. Our mission is to add to the world's store of knowledge and support other people who do. We are in for a treat this morning and this afternoon as we learn about the evolution of mapping and the role of women, cartographers, geographers, geologists, etc., in this evolution. And this morning, it's my great pleasure to introduce a couple of outstanding women geographers. The first is Janice Monk. Janice Monk is an honorary professor in the School of Geography at the University of Arizona, where she previously served as executive director of the Southwest Institute for Research on Women. And Jan tells me that this is her second trip to Washington this week. So thank you, Jan. Her research emphasizes histories of women in American geography, geography in higher education, and collaborative work on indigenous communities in southeastern Australia. Dr. Monk has been president of the Association of American Geographers, and among her awards are Doctora Honoris Causa, from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Laureate d'Honneur from the International Geographical Union, Outstanding Achievement Award from the Society of Women Geographers, Lifetime Achievement Honors from the Association of American Geographers, and the Australia International Medal of Institute of Australian Geographers. So Jan does span the world. She is one of the biggest networkers I know. She knows more women geographers around the world than anyone else I know. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janice Monk. Jan? Okay.
Well, it's a pleasure to be part of this event and to celebrate women mapping the world. Because we're in Washington, what I plan to talk to you about this morning are some women geographers who worked in this city in the 20th century and whose work involved mapping not only as makers of maps, but in a range of roles, such as caring for maps, promoting their use, developing resources so that maps could be created, and using maps for analysis. Each of the women I'm going to talk about was a member of the Society of Women Geographers. And I'm going to draw on SWG materials, including oral histories, reports in the annual bulletins, items held in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, as well as other archives and research articles, and interviews I conducted myself with with those women who were living in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in exploring their work, what I want to do is to think about how changing contexts of their times, as well as aspects of their personal lives and networks, were salient for their careers. By comparison with what is usually presented by people who study the history of American geography, who usually focus on men whose careers were in universities, especially research universities, those of us who are interested in the place of women in geography have turned to other arenas. Women travelers, for example, and their travel writings, or others who taught in what were called normal schools and later teachers' colleges. But women in government have received very little attention, although various records indicate that the federal government has long provided a significant professional opportunities for women who have made important professional contributions. Fittingly, I'm going to begin with Clara Egli-Laguerre, whose career here at the Library of Congress spanned 7 decades and has many outstanding contributions. Clara came to be in Washington following the death of her father when she, with her mother and sister, moved to this city. And she first completed a secretarial course. Her uncle, who was employed at the Library of Congress, then found her a position here as a typist and clerical assistant. In 1915, she moved to the Geography and Map Division as a junior assistant, filing maps and serving the public. Studying nights and weekends, she earned her bachelor's and then a master's in library science in the 1930s at George Washington University, and she gradually advanced through the ranks in the library, working in cataloging, reference, acquisitions, as a reference cataloger, to become assistant and then acting chief of the Geography and Map Division. In her early 40s, she married fellow librarian Russell Laguerre and continued working at the library. After World War II, she devoted herself to bibliographic research and writing, and her work has been recognized by an array of honors, both in the Association of American Geographers, the Special Library Association, through the Library of Congress, and also from the Society of Women and Geographers. I've just put up a few of her publications here, which deal basically with the history of cartography, with categorizing the kinds of materials that are available here in the Library of Congress, and in doing bibliographic work on cartography. The next 2 women I'll profile, Sophia Saucerman and Helen Strong, studied at the University of Chicago, where the geography department was long an outstanding one, and where several faculty members maintained connections that had begun those particular faculty members had begun in Washington in World War I. Sophia was widowed as a young mother. She'd already lost a son, and she had then a daughter who was just a couple of years old. And she realized she needed to further her education and develop a career that would allow her to support her daughter, and herself, of course. So she started at Mankato Teachers College, and one of the instructors there encouraged her to go on in Chicago, where he himself had graduated. And she went there and earned a bachelor's degree in 1919 and then a master's in 1923. While she was there, she worked as a research assistant to Professor Good, who is noted for the Good's atlases that went through many editions. On graduation, she was offered a position at a private women's college, but they wanted her to live in a dormitory, and she couldn't have her daughter with her. So, aided by geographers at Chicago, She got statistical and mapping work from 1923 to 27 in a temporary appointment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then went on to a 30-year career in the Department of State with the U.S. Board on Geographic Names. She retired at age 70. Her book on European boundary changes is a detailed compilation prompted by the State Department's need at that time to identify how territorial challenges would affect identification of immigrants to the United States. The research involved dealing with maps, postal guides, and other sources, and the book includes creation of maps and tables detailing former and current boundaries. Later on, she also worked on South American and Central boundary problems. The next person I want to talk about is Helen Strong, who in 1921 was the first woman to earn a PhD in geography at the University of Chicago. As this quotation notes, which those of you at the back may not be able to read, she was early on inspired by the lure of maps. Any map took me on a journey around the world. But she dreamed of applying geography to practical business problems. Between her bachelor's and PhD, her Chicago connections led her to Washington to work with O.E. Baker, then in the Department of Agriculture, on his research, which at the time was doing preparation for the Paris Peace Conference. But what Strong saw was that his work with agriculture had wider applications in other fields, particularly for the geography of business and industry. She had a short appointment at the University of Missouri as a faculty member for a couple of years, but then came to Washington, initially in the Department of Commerce, where she worked for 10 years. Addressing such topics as U.S. trade in raw materials, especially of exports to Western Europe, as they would be affected by damages that had occurred there during World War I. For Strong, maps were a key tool in promoting the value of geographic perspectives for successful location of businesses and sales. And she gained publicity for her work. She published quite widely. You can see some of these deal with trade, some of them with agriculture, some of them with making maps in the Department of Commerce, and later I'll mention how she moved through other areas. But her, she got quite a lot of publicity for her work, and you probably maybe not able to read these at the back, but you'll note that the quote about her early career is from an article, a full-page article in the Washington Post in 1930, talking about her work in mapping. And even this one I found from 1927 in Popular Mechanics, Workers' Map Maker Wins Fame for Woman. So she was quite widely known and recognized for her work. Sensitive to issues of mapping and what maps convey, among the causes that Strong promoted was to use the Malvida projection rather than the Mercator projection as one that would give more useful impressions for those making locational decisions. Following her work at the Department of Commerce, she transferred to the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey for 2 years, 1933 through 35. It's not clear what prompted that move, though it may have reflected the not unusual reorganizations of federal government agencies, something that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But it also occurred about the time that the monthly publication titled Geography News, which reported on world events, new maps, and atlases, was discontinued by the Division of Economic Research in the Department of Commerce. In her new location, important among her projects was historical research on the development of international time zones and their implications for transportation and commercial activities. But by 1936, the environmental disasters of the Dust Bowl saw a strong move to the Soil Conservation Service in the Department of Agriculture. Here she may have been engaged less with mapping, but was heavily involved in educational outreach, traveling widely, often giving multiple speeches in a day to teachers, agricultural workers, women's clubs, on radio, to the press, and as a consultant for bodies such as the National Education Association. With the onset of World War II, however, Strong moved to military intelligence in the War Department, later returning to the Foreign Economic Administration. Strong understood the value of connections among women and of strategizing to achieve her goals. In 1930, for example, attempting to foster attention to the field of business geography, she wrote to one of the few women geographers many academic geographers have heard of, Ellen Churchill Semple. "Isn't it a great game? With you, I know it is the most, business geography, she means, is the most significant subject for the Worcester meetings of the association, but they don't realize it. They will, though. You and I will swing this project with flying colors, two unbusinesslike women." She was aware of challenges that women faced professionally. Writing of Dr. Esther Anderson, who had retired in 1958 as an associate professor from the University of Nebraska, Strong offered the opinion, had she not been a woman, she would have received university promotion. You know how some universities feel about having only men on their faculties. This is not a criticism, merely a statement of fact reflecting long-time custom. That was in a letter, by the way, to Benita Harris, long-term employee of Society of Women Geographers. Her forthrightness and strategies may have had mixed receptions. Later, Lois Olson, another SWG member in an oral history, commented, "Helen Strong has sometimes been criticized for being aggressive, but I think we all ought to praise her for it because it made it possible for the next generation of us to advance without being aggressive." I now turn to three women whom I met in the late 1970s through the Association of American Geographers and through SWG. Marge Elliott, here on the left, Betty Burrell, some of you may have known both of these women, and Evelyn Pruitt, whom I interviewed in the all three of them in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Their careers illustrate the intersections of personal and professional life and also the role of networks in careers. As a child in England, Marge Howarth enjoyed making maps that gave her an artistic outlet that she didn't get from other kinds of assignments. And she came to love geography early in her school days. The family later moved to Detroit, and there Marge was disappointed to find that no geography was included in her high school curriculum. But in college, as an overload, she took a geography course and was fortunate to be taught by Dutch-born geographer Samuel van Valkenburg, who had connections with the then strong and still strong geography department at Clark University. And he encouraged her to go there. Clark is noted, especially in that period, for having welcomed women into their graduate programs. They had a key field course which enabled you to get out and do, climatic measurements in the middle of the night, and field mapping and so on, and a very active social community. The Clark connections were important for Marge in a number of stages of her career. After graduation, and now we're entering into the Depression years when jobs are scarce, she got a short contract for field research with Ellsworth Huntington on a study of the severely distressed Depression-era economy of rural New Hampshire. Next, she had a year's contract with a Boston publisher editing textbooks, but work was hard to find, and she was also needed for family reasons back home in Detroit. So she returned to Detroit and found a teaching job, although she had long felt that she didn't want to be either a teacher or a nurse, which were then the key known professions for women. With the outbreak of World War II and some relief in family responsibilities, and with encouragement from other family members, she applied to the US Navy and was initially slated to serve as a monitor in a women's dormitory for naval waves. But a Clark alumni saw her credentials and recommended her for an appointment in the US Naval Hydrographic Office in Washington. Thus began Marge's long career in government. Post-war, it seemed she might have to return to Detroit, but then a Clark alumni working at the Bureau of the Census sought her out for an opening preparing for the 1950 census, where she would supervise field teams across the United States, working on setting up the census districts, which would be used for data collection and then subsequently, of course, important in mapping, for the expanding unincorporated areas outside central cities. Marge progressed at the census, but on learning that a male colleague on a project she was leading was being paid more than she was, Marge complained and found an alternative position in the Army Map Service. While there, again partly thanks to her Clark credentials and connections, she was offered a contract for the US Agency for International Development to do preparatory field research for a national atlas of Indonesia. The health of her aging father seemed to preclude going, but on his death, this changed the situation, and so she worked in the field for over a year in Indonesia, going out and identifying what data and sources were where and that might be used in creating the National Atlas. Subsequently, she returned to the Census Bureau as chief of the Statistical Areas Branch. Over the years, Marge also co-authored textbooks with a former Clark geographer who first brought her to work at the census. On retirement, she married Will Elliott, a retired Washington area professional. Family was also key in Betty Didcot Burrell's career. The death of her father, quite young, when she also was quite young, her father was a professor at George Peabody College in Tennessee, and his death caused changes in the family finances and altered her aspirations to be what she described as the world's most famous archaeologist. It seemed more practical at the time to earn a master's in librarianship and then in geography. She took up a library position at the University of Arizona, but on a trip home to Tennessee, she met a visiting geographer, Samuel Boggs of the State Department, who was developing intelligence services in World War II Washington and needed someone who had both geography skills and library skills. Though she wasn't eager to live in Washington, the prospect offered her a substantial salary increase. Thus began her long career, initially in the State Department. In the war years, the hours could be long and tasks urgent. Among one of her late-night tasks when she worked until 2 or 3 in the morning was to prepare an index for a map that President Roosevelt was to take the next day to Yalta. Post-war, unlike many women who had temporary appointments in Washington, she was included in a group of professionals who were retained and moved shortly thereafter to the newly founded Central Intelligence Agency. It was organized along regional lines, and she went into the Western Hemisphere Division, organizing maps and other resources. Among other tasks was working with the Inter-American Geodetic Survey and becoming involved with the Pan-American Institute for Geography and History, getting people into the field to collect written materials and maps. Betty rose to become chief of the library's Western Hemisphere Division and was responsible for organizing overseas resources to support a variety of agencies. After her mother's death, for whom she had made a home in Washington, she married the widowed geographer Pete Burrell, geographer at the State Department. I want to move now and finally to Evelyn Lord Pruitt, who described herself to me as a free spirit I can't be held down. Evelyn's enthusiasm, and whom when I first met, by the way, and who introduced me to membership in the Society of Women Geographers, she and Alice Taylor, also an SWG member who worked for the American Geographical Society in New York, took me to lunch at an AAG meeting to recruit me for SWG, but at the time, Evelyn was wearing a button that said, "Uppity Women Unite." So you know where she's coming from. As a high school student, Evelyn served as a chauffeur for her sister, who was a geography major at UCLA. Her sister couldn't drive, but Evelyn could. So she served as chauffeur for her sister, but took part in the activities. And as she said, what was going on in these field trips was outdoor mapping. You had plane tables and you paced things off and you went to interesting places and you talked to people. That's the best part of geography. So she entered UCLA as a freshman in geography. Her first choice was to become a meteorologist. And I'll read this to you since those at the back probably can't see it. She first talked to a geography professor about her aspirations to become a meteorologist. And he said, well, in the history of the Weather Bureau, there's never been a woman employed. And I thought, oh boy. Well, at that time you didn't. It was just a way of life. You didn't get arrogant. You didn't get up on your high horse. Now you'd sue him. So I decided I'd be a geologist. I spoke to the head of geology and said I'd like to switch from geography. He said, well, there's a problem. You'd have to go to field camp. Oh, Evelyn said, that's no problem. Well, yes, it is. We can't accommodate women. Then you'll waive the requirements, says Evelyn. No, we won't. I can't go, and I have to go. Well, you can't be a geologist. So Evelyn went back to geography and took all of the field courses and physical geography courses she could. With World War II, while she was working on her master's degree, she saw the opportunity for work in Washington, where the Coast and Geodetic Survey was advertising for people to do charting. So with her bachelor's and some advanced work, she applied and was attracted by the salary of $2,000 a year, which just seemed like a fortune to her. To her, charts were associated with climate, you know, mapping temperature and precipitation and so on. So when asked if she could do charts, she said yes, she could, and she was hired. But of course, she very soon found herself editing aeronautical charts. She was given professional ranking, one that seemed as if she'd be able to keep her position post-war, whereas many of the other wartime hirees, particularly of the women who came to Washington, were temporary. But with professional ranking, she was assured she would be able to come back. By chance, actually riding a bus home, she was reading a women's magazine, and she saw an advertisement for a summer program on the Arctic at McGill University in Canada, and she enrolled. On return, however, she found that the promise for continuing employment wasn't kept. But at McGill, she had met the director of the U.S. Office of Naval Research. And returning to Washington, he recruited her to collaborate in expanding the office. This led to her long-term position and service as the director of the geography branch at ONR. She led in developing grants for Arctic and coastal research, foreign field studies, and quantitative approaches in physical geography. She organized key conferences and promoted interdisciplinary research centers. From the perspective of our conference today, a key aspect of her work was advancing the field of remote sensing, as she recognized the challenges that were arising with developing the increasingly complex keys for reading aerial photos, and remote sensing images were becoming available. And in fact, she organized with a major conference to bring people together to decide how to deal with this. And indeed, the term remote sensing is credited to Evelyn, although she doesn't necessarily think that's or didn't think that was a big deal, to get credit for developing this name for the process. Evelyn was very active in professional organizations and received an array of recognition from them, from universities, from the government, and from the Association of American Geographers. From the point of view of SWG, a key contribution of Evelyn was to leave us a very substantial legacy of close to $1 million, which is now used for supporting women graduate students' research in geography in the US. And as I mentioned, the button that she wore, Uppity Women Unite, is still, in a sense, is part of her legacy. She also left close to $1 million to Louisiana State University, which for its Coastal Institute, and that also sponsors an annual Pruitt Lecture by a woman geographer, and also support for graduate students, and some additional money also to UCLA. So I hope these short biographies have introduced some of the links between dynamics of women's careers, of the significance of personal values and also the constraints under which women operated, of the influences of political, economic, and social contexts, and of the roles of professional networks, and also of the willingness of these women to move across boundaries and develop new skills, and also to remind us of the changing constructions of gender that have enabled younger women now to enter career opportunities that were very challenging for these women. At the same time, these stories, as I've attempted to present them, illustrate how personal and professional lives intersect, and of the resilience of these women as they forged important careers and made significant contributions in which maps and mapping played an ongoing role. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Tanya Atwater, who is Emeritus Professor of Tectonics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She received her education at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of California at Berkeley, and Scripps Institute of Oceanography, completing her PhD in 1972. Dr. Atwater's research has concerned various aspects of tectonics, ranging from the fine details of seafloor spreading processes to global aspects of plate tectonics. She has participated in or led numerous oceanographic expeditions in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, including 12 dives to the deep floor in the tiny submersible Alvin. She is especially well known for her works on plate tectonic history of Western North America and the San Andreas Fault System. Dr. Atwater is devoted to science communications, teaching students at all levels, presenting lectures, workshops, and field trips for K-12 teachers and for public groups, and consulting for the written media, museums, television, and video productions. She directs the Educational Multimedia Visualization Center at University of California, Santa Barbara, creating geographical animations that are used extensively by teachers, museums, and the media. Dr. Atwater has served on various national and international committees and panels. Her recent honors include the Geographical Society of America Cordilleran Section's Best Paper Award, National Science Foundation Director's Award for Distinguished Teaching Scholars, and Germany's Leopold van Buch Medal for Outstanding Career Contributions in Geosciences. She was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1997. And having seen a presentation by Dr. Atwater a few years ago at a SWG conference, I was thrilled to see that she was on the program. We're all in for a great treat. Dr. Tanya Atwater.
So I'm going to talk about the plate tectonic revolution. Just by wonderful luck, I stepped right into the start of it, and I've spent my whole life in it, really. And it's just full of mapping. It's a mapper's paradise. A mapping of all sorts of different characteristics of the Earth. And so I'll try to lay that out. I'll talk about women, too, near the end. But of course, I'm really just passionate about the whole subject. So the idea of continental drift had been around for a long time, especially among geoscientists of the southern continents. I mean, their continents fit together so well, and all the geology crisscrosses across. I mean, you can't resist if you work down there. Unfortunately, there were hardly any of them. And it did get a boost in a book from Alfred Wegener in the 1920s, but it still was not really not accepted. All the people working in the north, for good reason, it didn't seem such a good solution to things because our pieces have crashed together and pulled apart lots of times, so it's not so clear as the southern ones, which were part of Gondwana for more than half a billion years. So here it goes. One of my agendas in this talk is just to show you a bunch of my animations. And, and so you'll know they're there, and feel free to use them anyway. They're a lot of work to make, so the more they're used, the better. So the Earth is flat, did you know? This is my flat Earth version of continental drift. And we had that idea for a long time, but it really suddenly came together in the late 60s. And so I'm going to tell you that story. I did write it up for Naomi Oreskes' book. I'll have the reference to it at the end. And so if you just want to read about those years, it was just an amazing, amazing time to be a young person starting out, or to be anybody who was in it. Continental drift was considered foolish, a wild idea as far as the northern geoscientists were concerned. Probably it was because they couldn't think of a mechanism. If you had Africa and South America together and now they're apart with an ocean in between, how do you get an ocean in between? And are they plowing through the Earth? People just couldn't figure it out. I also secretly think they didn't like it because who wants to be in a field that kindergartners could do? The shapes were so obvious. Okay, so it really turned out that suddenly there was a huge upheaval and everybody moved over when we figured out how the oceans work. So Scripps Institute of Oceanography, that's in La Jolla, California, the start of the plate tectonic revolution hit there in December of 1966 with a talk by Fred Vine. He just laid out some spectacular magnetic data that I'll show you in a little while. And everybody in the whole institute had gone in as fixists and came out as mobilists. This data is so powerful, you just don't have much choice. I arrived there in January of '67, about 2 weeks after his talk, and the place was a total uproar. I thought, oh, this august institute I'd come to, and oh my gosh, you saw that picture of all the records put out on the floor? That's how all the halls looked. They had run back to the closet and gotten out all the magnetic records that they never knew what to do with, and they were rolled out and all, and people were crawling around on the floor. My classes, they didn't say this is, Geology 122. They said, oh, we have to tell you about this. It was just crazy, and really it was like that the whole time I was there. So what led to this revolution? Mostly mapping. And how has the subject evolved? Through a lot of mapping. All sorts of other things too, of course, because it really changed all the fields of earth science. But the mapping was absolutely in the center of it. And as described already, most of the advances in mapping and in concepts were linked to the development of new technologies. And a lot of those were military developments that just spun off to the rest of us. Let's see, the other things I already said, I'm going to show you a lot of concepts of moving images. Images, first of all, but then when they move, I've just been astonished how much difference that makes. We're really organized to understand moving images, and we're born that way. I mean, especially if it has big teeth and it's moving this way. But, it takes us, I don't know, a decade to learn how to read well, but every child can understand a moving image. So the onset, the ability to make computer animations, which suddenly became good for even klutzy folks like me, just has made a huge difference. And then it's even better is if you can put hands on it, so I'll show you some of that too. Most of all, I just want to tell you how fun it was. It was incredibly fun and exciting to be in that revolution. And I still really have fun with it. Okay, and this is just the list. It's much longer than this, but echo sounding came through mid-century, and it was really waiting for stable timers, because if you make a noise and then you listen to it echo off the seafloor, you have to know how long it took in order to say how deep the ocean is. And I suppose that was a World War II development, to get oscillators that really kept good time. Deep sea magnetometers, they held the key, though who would have guessed? And they were originally developed to look for submarines. The seismicity, just mapping out the world's earthquakes and how they lay out. It turns out most of them are on plate boundaries. And the good earthquake maps appeared about a decade after they put out the worldwide array of seismometers to monitor test ban treaties. The earthquakes were just a spin-off of that, or a side effect, and they're fantastic. Deep sea drilling techniques, I guess that would be more for industrial. The petroleum industry was really hot for that and helped us out. Ocean floor topography took a huge leap forward with satellite altimeters, and that was originally for the Navy, to be able to know very well what they were dealing with on the ocean floor, and especially to be able to drive submarines silently without running into seamounts. Good thing to know where they are. But that eventually became more and more declassified until all of us use them, and it's wonderful. I'll show you. And of course, navigation, that's the struggle forever, especially at sea. And GPS is, I can't tell you what a miracle that is. I mean, when I started out, that was the biggest job on every survey, to figure out where we were and where we'd been. Oh, it was so tedious and always just the best guess. And even after we got satellite navigation, we'd get a fix every 4 hours. Then when GPS came in and then was finally given for use of ordinary people, of scientists, suddenly we could get a fix easily within a few feet every nanosecond if you wanted one. I mean, the young students, they just think, oh my God, these ancients, they were taking sun sights, Lorraine was great, but it was only along the coast, so we were mostly stuck. If it was a cloudy day, we were really stuck. Then there's a million advances in computer sophistication, and each one has made a big difference too. Okay. Here's the Heezen and Tharp World Ocean Floor map that they put out in 1977. And I'm going to talk a bit about Marie Tharp, because even though she'll be featured later in the day, because she really set us off, though we didn't quite realize it at the time. That's what the map used to look like. You know, we just didn't know anything about the ocean floors. Quite early on, they figured out that there were continental shelves, because you can tell the depth of that just by lowering a weight on a rope, actually. But then there's a cliff around every continent. I mean, if the water wasn't in the way, we would be totally blown over by this cliff. It's called the continental slope. But it's by far the biggest feature on the map, and steepest and most consistent, except that we can't see it with our eyes. The crucial thing about this is that it showed us the true edges of the continents, so that when we try to fit them together, especially in high latitudes like up here, you know, if you try to fit to Nova Scotia, you'd be in big trouble. You really want to keep this whole edge of the continent here. It fits right up against that edge of Spain. It's really cool. You can see this edge. I just love this stuff. This edge fits right into there. I mean, look at that. Oh, my gosh. And then the usual ones. Okay. So then that was crucial for another reason. It gave us the whole concept that continental crust is really different than oceanic crust. And it's true, and that's a huge piece of the basis of the modern theories, is that the continents are made one way, they age. We have a whole history of how they work. The oceans are completely different. They're made by different processes completely. And so I'd say that's probably as important as knowing where the edges are, is seeing that just shallow continents and poof, down to the deep ocean. Very steep in most places. So first of all, Hesen and Tharp figured out that there was a mid-ocean ridge streaming through all the oceans. And I think other people were getting onto that too, but they really put it out and made us all think about it. And that in turn led to the first speculative ideas by Harry Hess and others of seafloor spreading. Harry Hess published it as an essay in geopoetry to say that the Atlantic was being made at the mid-ocean ridge, so that's how you put the new ocean in there. It was in such disrepute, the whole idea of continental drift. He would never get it published in a regular publication, so he had to put it in a meeting procedures, what's the word I want? It was a conference book where they have to take whatever people send them. But here's the basic idea, back to my animations, is that the plates are moving apart, brand new material comes up into the hole, otherwise you'd pull a hole to the center of the earth, see the devils down there. And it comes up and it cools and makes new plates. So you see the plates just move out. I'll talk about these other things in a minute. That's seafloor spreading. One of the things that really made this all work was figuring out the oceanic fracture zones and the concept of transform faults. And we got those mostly from mapping ocean topography and seismicity. So you can even see it on this map. I mean, Murray was really onto it. Bruce Hesen, she worked with him, and he would go out to sea. She wasn't allowed on the ship, and collect all this bathymetric data. And then she would sit down and be the analyzer and the artist, and she really got onto it early on, all this fabric crossing the mid-ocean ridges everywhere. There's a big fabric. Here's a closer up of their South Atlantic map, and you can see the mid-ocean ridge is coming along here, and then it has these big offsets, just like a staircase. It was nice to figure out what that's about for the purposes of just understanding what's there, but it actually gave us a gift of rigid plates. So when people first saw this, the land geologists, they said, oh, look, there's a huge fault across here. And it offset the mid-ocean ridge from there over to there. And there are a lot of smaller ones, too, when you really look. But they'd say, okay, that's an offset of 1,000 miles. And they'd look in the land, no fault. And here, too, you know, they said, wait a minute. How could you have that much offset and then have it suddenly disappear? I mean, it just drove everybody crazy for a little while there. But here's the key to it. The seismologists, meanwhile, had been locating the earthquakes using that worldwide net. And it's clear that all the activity is right at the center There's a transform fault. That's one of the fracture zones crosses right there. Ridges. So what they saw, isn't that beautiful? And this is really old, before they got really good at locating the earthquakes. It's a connect the dots game, you know. Kindergartners could do it. But it showed us no way was there a big fault all active all the way across. So we had to rethink the whole geometry there. And here's the movie I used to show it. So these are those same spreading centers that I showed you before, and they have these offsets. That's the active transform fault. And then these old fracture zones that stream out across the ocean floor, they're fossil transform faults, it turns out. And I put these arrows on for a couple purposes, but I was really pleased to see how they work. So you can see right in the middle, they're scraping by each other. Once they get out away from the spreading system, this is a rigid plate just marching out. And these are fossil transform faults that got put into it when it was being made, and since then it's just drifting across the ocean. You can see it's just that whole big plate marching out together as a rigid plate. You'd think that this offset, you know, should go across the ocean, but this new way of thinking about it suddenly made all the ocean spreading centers make sense, but it also gave us that idea about rigid plates, that you really could take two plates and just plain as rigid pieces pull them apart. And these transform faults, they show us what direction they're going. Great way to measure it. So all of us use this chart, at least to talk about all the concepts, for decades, until the satellite altimetry maps came out, and especially when they released all the data so we could really see them sharply. And there it is. And boy, it's not very different. I mean, look at them. See these ridges over here? There they are. See the mid-ocean ridge going right up the center through Iceland. There it goes. I mean, they had all the essentials right. They did. In detail, it's much cleaner. And you can get even cleaner these days with good ship tracks, but that's going 10 miles an hour, you know, chug, 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 chug for weeks and weeks, pinging on the bottom or even pinging with a big array, and you get one little line. The satellites, they put out the first map after a few months of going around the Earth. And we just went, oh my God, why did we do all that work? Especially in the southern oceans where it's huge waves and all the stuff on the deck keeps getting ice on it. And it's horrible, horrible place to work. And just poof, there it was. I mean, if there's a lot of sea ice on the surface, this method doesn't work so well. And who would have guessed? The way you get this oceanic topography is just by looking at the height of the top of the water. You know, I've been out there. There are big waves and tides. It's amazing. It's amazing. But the locations of the satellites are so well known, and they repeat the paths so many times that they can just sort that all out. Let me get this. Look at all these fracture zones. Maria was absolutely right about the fracture zone, and there's the spreading center in the center. Let's see, even more fun is the next part north. So here's the North Atlantic, there's North America and Africa. And in this part, it's slow enough spreading that the whole mid-ocean ridge has a rift in the middle of it. You see this? It just shows up wonderfully. Who would have guessed it could be so good? And look, this is even more fun. Here's one of the fracture zones. The activity right now is just on the transform fault right here. But look at it, it has this big wave in it, this big S. And that's a very distinct topography that you almost never, it's a funny kind of symmetry. And this is one I made for a class just to show it. If you just had a regular old spreading center, you would make a bunch of ground. These are isochrons showing, and offset by transform faults. But then if you change the direction and let it go for a while, you'll end up with an S. The fracture zone, it'll change character some, and it'll have these S shapes in them. So this side it's bowed up, and this side it's bowed down. You can just see it. Here's the new direction, and this is remembering the old direction out here. We use the transform faults to figure out how the plates are moving right now, but for the past, we can just use each little piece of this to show how those plates were moving apart in the past. It's just great. Then here comes the magnetic story, and they knew that the ocean floor was striped. when you just tow a magnetometer behind your ship back and forth, we call it mowing the lawn, you discover that there are these stripes all over the ocean floor. Not everywhere, but there are a lot of places. This is a survey that actually they were just using the newly installed LORAN to survey the topography off the shore of California. Let's see, here's Washington and Oregon, and California's down here. And that these Raff and Mason said, you know, you guys, while you're doing this, you should hang a magnetometer back there. Well, it won't hurt anything, you know. And that's actually how an awful lot of magnetic data was collected. Just, it's easy, so what the hell, you know, you're going to be driving along anyway. And then in the early days, it came off on a strip of paper with a pen going like this as the paper rolled out. I'll talk about that in the end. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we knew there were stripes, but what Vine did and what he told them about that day at Scripps was this. This is still the most beautiful crossing of a magnetic crossing of a mid-ocean ridge I've ever seen. It's in the kind of down near New Zealand, and it just happens to be a place with a really good spreading center, really steady, no seamounts to give you funny, spurious things. And look at this. This is the stripe that represents the present day rocks that are magnetized towards the north. But then look out here. This one is symmetrical with this one. Here's fat, skinny, medium. Fat, skinny, medium. This is my favorite one. We call it 4 fingers jack. The third finger's small. And whenever you see that, you know where you are. 5 million years is right there. It's so wonderfully symmetrical. And and furthermore, a long normal time and then a short reversal, then short normal, a long reversed, those are all right in the reversal time scale that people had been working out by doing one volcano at a time on the land. And there it is on the ocean, laid out and symmetrical. It's so hard to think of any way that you could make this pattern other than by seafloor spreading in the oceans. Just people tried, and it was hopeless. They just could not figure out any other way. And so we might still think of a way, but a lot of people have tried for a lot of decades. It's just so clear. That's what changed everybody's mind at Scripps. They said, all the pieces are moving and new oceans being made, and end of argument. Nothing like a good data set to stop people from arguing. So then the Vine-Matthews idea is that here's the time scale, millions of years. So that was the long normal. Those two little ones, there's the long reversed. Here's the reversals for 4 fingers. I'm sorry, the normal periods for 4 fingers jack, etc. And if you just think it's being made at a mid-ocean ridge and then broken in half going each way, then you'd get a pattern just like that one we saw. Okay, this is my animation showing that. The Earth's field, it takes a few thousand years to reverse, but that's nothing in millions of years. So it's really like an almost instant reversal. Okay, so that's what the field was doing for the last 3 million years. And this time, here's the last part of that same one, the last 2 million years. And here's my animation again. I'll call out what it says over here. So now we're in the reverse time. We're coming up on a short normal. There it is, and then reversed, and then a long normal. It's just the lava that's coming out to make the new ocean floor is just acquiring the magnetization of the field that it finds itself sitting in as it cools, and it's just frozen right in there. And we can just come along. It really feels like magic. You can come along the top of the water with this magnetometer out there, and the sharks are chewing on it, and you can see it back there bouncing away. And every few seconds it makes a measurement, and it's coming out these curves that show us these stripes. It's just, so I can, without ever getting near the ocean floor, I can tell you how old it is under the ship. Better and better as the time goes by. This is some lines from the South Atlantic that I collected just to show the students what they look like. And here's from the Northeast Pacific. And if you could look at them carefully, you would see that these are much easier to see. They're much more spread out. I colored them up for you a little. So this part from Cron 10 to 13, there it is. It's still distinct, but it's not like when it's laid out at a much faster spreading rate. So I was really spoiled. These lower ones were the ones I was working with when I was in graduate school. This is going out to about 80 million years. See, here's the dates we've got these days, 50, 60, 70, 80. And then there's a quiet time when the Earth didn't seem to be reversing, and then there's another whole set, the M series, that's only in some very old oceans. I mean, it just tells you really the story of how all the oceans that are now on Earth were made. It's quite remarkable. And from that data, we get this map, which is in most textbooks. It's just the age of the ocean floor, and here's the color scheme. So red and orange is hot, so that's young. You're getting older and older. The only really old Jurassic seafloor is in these blues in the North Atlantic, because that's the first place that Pangea began to break up. And there's a patch of it still left in the old part of the Pacific that's just hasn't been subducted yet. Look at the Pacific. This will be a big subject of mine, is it's not symmetrical. Let's see, we've been seeing that in the topographic maps too. The mid-ocean ridge is not in the middle of the ocean. It's way over on the Americas side. And so we have one very clear flank of a spreading center that's really laid out fast, and we're completely missing the other side. I think that's the reason that the Scripps people didn't get onto it first, because they didn't have the symmetry to work with. And you just really, to talk yourself into it, you really need the symmetry. So once you have that, it's just, you can make the continents and everything else move at steps of a 250,000 years or less. It's so precise, these dates. This is the Atlantic, and it's colored by age. The oldest are those dark blues. And when just using that, you know, I can tell you very well how it came apart. There. So there's 60 million years is in the light blue, and 40, and there's 20 and 0. I mean, that's just looks like a little cartoon, but it's very precise. At any scale, we can do it to much more precision than geology ever had before. It's quite wonderful. I know I keep using words like that, but oh well. Okay, well, that's the oceans. What about the land? Actually, most geologists work on the land, and that's what they really care about, what this theory has to do with them. And so let me show you a couple of those. Here's my Pangea breakup again, but get ready, you're ready. Here it goes. These loose pieces have just been mashing their way into the underbelly of Asia. So this whole mountain belt that the alpine Himalayan belt is all just showing us the collisions quite recently of all these pieces, including Italy, against the underside of Eurasia. When you go in those mountain belts, I mean, I think this is part of the reason the land geologists were cynical about plate tectonics. You go in there and the rocks that started out flat layers are all, broken in faults and gorgeous big folds and just really a chaos. And you say, wait a minute, that's not a rigid plate, give me a break. But they were always looking at the plate edges. This is a plate boundary between two, and sure enough, in the land, which is superimposing each history onto the next, it's much less straightforward than in the oceans, but nonetheless, the way I figured out, or the way we figure out how India's colliding in, is by just adding up all the motions in all the spreading centers around a circuit. So we can say at each time where India was and where Asia, and when they begin to hit, and then, of course, there's all sorts of geological mapping going on to work out the whole history of shortening and uplift. So I made this movie for my ex's 50th birthday, because he works on this collision all the time. And so this is north is to the right, and here it comes. This is about 10 years old, but this is how the collision looked. About 50 million years it began to hit, and then just mashed and mashed its way in. Tibet was doubled in thickness. That's why it stands so high. I mean, be impressed by Tibet. It's average 5 kilometers high. I mean, that's higher than Mount Whitney by far. It's just amazingly high. And it's because its crust has been so thickened, it just floats high. The crust is the light part of the stack in the top of the Earth. And so if you make the floater part extra thick, it'll stand extra high. That's geodesy and a lot of other things. Okay, here's my favorite version of it. Mush. You don't want this one if you want to look at how it all works. And it's probably a pretty good depiction of how the faults develop and thicken and so on. But, oof, 50 million years in a crash. Okay, so the other question besides seafloor, how you make new ocean was, well, either the Earth is getting bigger and bigger or else you're running over it somewhere else. And so that actually was a much harder problem because you're getting rid of the evidence. So it's diving down in the Earth, so you can't go around on the surface and figure it out, except that there's a very deep trench right there where it's going down. So, but the mapping of the earthquakes did it superbly. They can see the earthquakes going right down into the ground. They just show us that rigid plate diving in. On the land, there's a lot of other evidence once we got onto it, so the geologists love this subduction stuff. Here's the oceanic plate going down. It's carrying water with it, and when you put water into very hot rocks, it facilitates their melting. So they melt, it sends up the magma, which is lighter than the rocks, up to near the surface. Some of it cools and makes granite. That's what the whole Sierra Nevada is about, and all those granite walls in Yosemite and all that. And some of it erupts at the surface. Very explosive volcanoes. So they make all those beautiful ring of fire volcanoes, like Mount Fuji. I mean, they tear your heart out. They're so beautiful, but they're really dangerous because they have all that water and CO2 dissolved in the magma. And when you take off the pressure, it's just like a champagne bottle that you shook. It just, the lava's just blasted into tiny bits, and that's what volcanic ash is. Volcanologists tend to die young, and they usually die in one of those. Let's see. So there it goes. It also piles up a big pile of oceanic junk that's being scraped off at the front edge. So in California, the Franciscan Formation that San Francisco's built on is just a big pile of ocean junk. It kind of decorates the whole coastal region. And here's the San Joaquin Valley. Probably some of the vegetables you ate yesterday came from there. It doesn't have ocean on it anymore, but that huge, thick, very rich collection of sediments. In Western North America, that's where I cut my teeth and had so much fun in the early days. It's one of the very few places that you can use the geometric precision of the seafloor spreading to talk about things on land. I mean, that's pretty unusual. The land geologists, for the most part, in seafloor spreading, they can see when their continent first breaks up. It's really exciting, all these faults and lava and everything. And then they drift away, and all the activities at the spreading center, and we call them passive margins. They're just frozen into the middle of the plate, and, it just slowly cools and sinks, and sediments collect. And so that's how most of the Atlantic margins look. They're just a continental shelf with a big pile of sediments that collected as the edge of the continent cooled down and sank in. The West Coast of the Americas mostly has subduction zones, and that's why I made that subduction animation to show that. But in our place, the subduction was, you could say it was extreme. It actually subducted the mid-ocean ridge. And that's why it's so asymmetrical. The mid-ocean ridge, you can see it in the Pacific, it's over on one side, and then it just runs right into the Gulf of California, and gonzo. You only have half of the spreading floor. You're missing the youngest part and the mid-ocean ridge itself and the whole other side. All that was subducted. So, that's how that revolution was. Can you imagine, as a graduate student, I worked out the history of the San Andreas Fault. How could that ever happen? I just had the right combination of geophysics, because I can't remember anything, so I couldn't do geology. But I loved geology, so I'd taken a whole bunch of it, and the combination was primo. I just was so lucky. Okay, well, here's an animation just to show you the San Andreas Fault. Right now, it ends at a triple junction right here at Mendocino. So here's California, right? And LA and San Francisco. there's still a little subducting plate left north of that, of Mendocino. That's the last remnants of this big subduction that went on for hundreds of millions of years. And then the fault comes down just outboard of most of San Francisco, has a big bend in it. It's just kind of rings around the edge of LA, and then it goes down the Gulf of California. It's a strike-slip fault. That is, the Pacific plate is going past North America, parallel to it, so it's just one side going past the other, not pulling holes and not making collisions, except where it does collide. Like when this isn't in the right direction right here, so there's a big mountain building right there and right here. And when it's the other wrong direction, you'll pull open a hole, and that's what all the basins in the Gulf of California are about. They're little tiny spreading centers that have been formed as Baja California was pulled off of Mexico. So there's the idea. The mid-ocean ridge was separating the Pacific plate from the Farallon plate, and it was subducted itself. And so suddenly North America was feeling the Pacific plate, which used to be, out there on the other side of the ocean. And the two of them they start scraping against each other, and they have to set up a relationship, and this is it. By lucky chance, I keep talking about luck, but it is. The Pacific plate was going northwest, approximately parallel to the coast. So rather than having a collision or a pull apart in this whole part, you can just tear off some pieces and carry them along. It first tore off these northern pieces, and then later on it took off all of Baja as well. So this is all part of North America, but it's just recently been torn off by the Pacific plate and the present plate boundary. I should tell you, there's a new boundary forming back here behind the Sierra Nevada. It's through Death Valley and Owens Valley and up through the Mojave Desert, so it's back here. And using GPS, I just love it. I assume GPS was originally designed to take missiles from someplace to Red Square. Something that can navigate something going like that can navigate the plates as well. You can go out, you can get the errors down to millimeters a year if you remeasure a spot a lot of times, and come back just in a couple years, you can see how the Earth is deforming. It's just, and furthermore, GPS for a while now has been every man's tool, every woman's tool. Any school can buy one and go out and make measurements, and just suddenly we're just seeing how the whole Earth is deforming. And Western North America's all the way out to the Rockies has minor deformation. So really you should say the plate boundary is between this Pacific plate and stable North America way back here. It's a real wide boundary. When they did that across this zone of earthquakes that's behind over there in Death Valley and Owens Valley, about a quarter of the whole motion between the Pacific Ocean and stable North America is being taken up on those faults. So it's in the San Andreas is in the middle of jumping or of being reestablished back at the back edge of California. So us coastal folks, we're not going to Alaska by ourselves. We're taking California with us. We're busy ripping it off right now. Okay. So how did we figure that out? I became a wiggle picker. And this is just the map off of, there's Mendocino, and this is Oregon and Washington. And here are all the ship tracks. They just went along measuring the magnetic field and going, boy, what is this? But you can see they correlate really well. This is Cron 5 is a big wide normal period. And Cron 7, 8, 9, I could teach you to do this interpretation in an hour or two. There are a lot of small details you learn as you go along, but the basic wiggle picking is really straightforward, especially in a place like this where the magnetic anomalies were made at a really good fast rate, so you can really see them. Look at all these lines, they correlate. So using that, we actually put out 3 maps. This was with my graduate student, Jeff Severinghouse, in the late 80s. This one and the next one east and the next one south. But in it, this just looks like a bunch of stripes, I realize. But we know the ages of every one of those edges of those stripes. And so you can paint it by age instead. So in this picture, there's the spreading center that's still active off of Oregon and Washington. So this little plate here, it's called the Juan de Fuca plate, is still diving under. It's still making volcanoes. That's the Cascade volcanoes, et cetera. It should have a trench offshore as it's diving down, but it's so full of sediments from the Columbia River that isn't very deep. Okay, so I've colored it by age. This is the youngest part out to 10 million years, 20 million years, 30 million years. All this lighter blues are younger, so they didn't exist yet. There was a plate on the other side that had this same pattern, symmetrical. So there we have the pattern, and what we're trying to figure out is how the mid-ocean ridge actually came to the subduction zone and set up this boundary between the Pacific plate and North America. Here's the age map again, and like I told you, it's very asymmetrical. This is all the Pacific Ocean here. And the mid-ocean ridge is not mid-ocean, it's over on the eastern side, and here it is running into the Gulf of California. There's that last little plate that's still active, the Juan Fuca plate. So it's not at all like these spreading oceans that were just part of Pangaea that came apart. This has subduction all the way, almost all the way around it, so the pattern of spreading in there could just lay anywhere with respect to the edges. Okay, so we know the pattern, we know the shape of the mid-ocean ridges, and we want to know where the Pacific plate was at different times. And it's just, you can really assume rigid plates. I mean, I made a flat Earth here, but this is on a sphere, and there's not very hard spherical geometry to pick up each rigid plate and move it to its new place. And so here's how we figure out how the Pacific plate here was moving past North America. This is a reconstruction we did for 20 million years ago. So we just look for the isochrons on the seafloor that are 20 million years old, cut away everything that's younger, and fit those broken pieces back together for where they were. And it just looks like this. We reconstruct the Pacific to the Antarctica, and then Antarctica to Africa, then all three of them to North America. And that shows us where two test points that we've been keeping track of started 20 million years ago compared to where they are now. So that's how we do it. For each step in time, it depends on rigid plates, and they, as far as we can tell, we get it better and better honed, and they're still rigid. After 50 years, they're still rigid. I'm astonished. Good thing, since I spent my life on it. Okay, well, so here's the answer. And here's time. So 38 million years ago, the mid-ocean ridge was still offshore, and this was the Farallon plate, still subducting, had been subducting for a couple 100 million years. And here it goes. The mid-ocean ridge is actually arriving at the trench. It all breaks up right at the end there. And then more and more gets subducted as time goes forward. And the section that is the Pacific North America plate boundary, the San Andreas system, is just this part that's missing the mid-ocean ridge. So instead of having a subduction zone, we've been transformed into the Pacific plate boundary. So it's complicated, but it's doable and it's clear. And God, what a trip. When we looked in detail at how the pieces got transferred to the Pacific plate, we start out with a subduction zone under the edge of North America, and now we've come to a point where these whole coastal rims have been broken off and added to the Pacific plate. So the history, the late Cenozoic history of California and Western North America is all hung on figuring out how those pieces got transferred and interacted. And there's one that's really cool. Watch this. Most of the pieces just get ripped off and carried along, but this little piece here, actually, it's like a stick at the edge of the river. One end is dragging and the other is being pulled along by the current, and we got twisted around. I'm saying we, because there's Santa Barbara. If I seem a little dizzy, you can see why. Actually, the GPS can see it turning. It's still turning. I made this little hands-on visualization. You ready? Okay, try it again. Okay. I've made about 1,000 of them for teachers so far. And if you think you'd use it, I've got some here, and if I run out of them, I can send you some. Okay, so for the evolution of the Ice Age glaciers and glacial lakes, those have been mapped for whole careers, especially of the Canadian geologist Arthur Dyke. He worked on where the moraines were for this huge ice sheet that was covering Canada at all the different times and working on dating them. And I just took his maps, he had about 35 of them for time steps, and animated it. And it's just so fascinating. This is on my website too, use it any way you want. Okay, so that was from 18,000 now, not million, to 6,000. Most of the ice was pretty much melted off like it is today by 6,000 years. So let's do it again. So this is the ice that was on the Canadian Rockies, and this was the main ice sheet on Canada. Hudson's Bay is under here. It was just weighted down by all that ice, and that's why it's still below sea level. It's popping up fast as we speak. The way this ice sheet was destroyed was sea level was rising until it went underneath there and kind of broke out the center. And it actually sent this huge fleet of icebergs you've been seeing going out, including one that carried a chunk of Canadian rock and dropped it in the sediments off of Spain. How's that for a good spew? So I did this with Steve Porter. He's an Ice Age geologist at Seattle. And I asked him, when exactly was this connection broken? And he just laughed at me. He said, today, when there's a really good freeze, the ocean in here freezes over. There's actually an island right in the middle of the Bering Strait there. And so they just get on their skidoos and go visit their friends in Asia. You know, yeah. If you had a really good coat and really good shoes, you don't even need a land bridge, but they had one. Okay, enough of that. So, women mapping the world. There's a substantial portion of the human race, including lots of women and including me, that's born map crazy. You guys probably recognize this. There are a bunch of map crazies in the room. We just have an innate passion for maps. And I meet people everywhere there when I just say, oh, I love maps, and they say, me too, men and women. We just have an innate passion for them and for visualizations. And we love working with them, and we love creating them. We love interpreting them. We just can't resist them. Just like you were talking about. I forget who that was who said that. She just couldn't resist. So I'm sure they were out there. Where were they? When I started, the first few American geophysical meetings I went to, I was it. I was the only female in the whole place. And in those days, all the men were in fancy suits. Geophysicists don't tend to be anymore. But women were, yeah, you couldn't wear a suit, and you couldn't even wear pants. So there I was straight out of Berkeley with flowers and beads and bare feet. I mean, there wasn't any uniform, so you can imagine the scene. Uppity women unite. So at the time I thought there just weren't any women, you know, they just weren't allowed to work in, and it's true, we weren't allowed to work in a lot of field situations. No women in Antarctica, no women on ships at sea. No, I met some women students who had been rejected from when they applied for summer jobs working in the field until they got their letter writers to write a letter that was gender neutral, and suddenly they were hired as the boss. You know, it was just really crazy. When I started at Scripps, just before that, there had been some lawsuits against discrimination against women, and it changed everything. I mean, I never threatened to sue anybody, but my advisor did. He'd go to these meetings and say, she could sue you, you know. It was enough. So it was a really crazy time to be breaking in the ships to having women aboard. And at first they would isolate us in some top cabin, you know, so we wouldn't poison the ship. I knew we'd made it when I got to sleep down in the bilge with all the male students. and they were horrified at the idea that men and women might sleep in the same room. And so the first trip as a young student that I ran was on this converted harbor tugboat. They converted it by changing its name. And we went out to survey that place just off the coast where the mid-ocean ridge was all breaking up into pieces. And there was only one scientist's bedroom, so we took all women. And it was very fun. The guys running the ship, they just couldn't believe it. Okay, well, so, but since then I've realized there were plenty of women out there working in mapping. During the wars especially, because they were missing the men who usually did it. But all the time, there were women in the background doing most of the work, actually. And, you know, you think of all that plotting and stuff, I mean, they were the human computers plotting each dot onto the map and figuring out where it was and taking those records that were made like this and turning them into, you know, not curved, and measuring them all off and figuring out where they were. So it's very tedious, but also it takes a lot of talent and understanding of navigation and of everything. So they were absolutely essential, I would say. There was the first map of the wiggly lines, magnetic anomalies in the Northeast Pacific was actually drafted out by Isabel Taylor. She was working for Bill Menard at the time, and she took each one of those records, measured little dots, figured out the navigation and put it on there, all those little wiggles. I mean, you have to be really patient and really careful, and that was mostly women doing it. Then the men would go to the meeting, you know, and strut, oh, look what I did, you know. Sorry, I'm too cynical, but I've been through a lot. But actually, there are plenty of men who were supporting us, too, and pushing at every step. So that brings me to where are the women now? Oh, I wanted to say one other thing about map crazies. You know, the Nazca lines in South America that were in Peru, they looked like a lot of straight lines and also drawings of monkeys, a monkey and a whale and things like that, that you could never see them unless you were up in the sky looking down at them. And so there are all these theories about how, you know, the aliens came in and landed or someone invented, and there's all sorts of crazy theories. But we map crazies, we know. Because when I'm walking around on the ground, in my head, I can see a map of myself, a little ant running around, you know, they knew perfectly well what they looked like from above, and they had a really, it's a perfectly natural thing to do. To, you know, if you've got a big space to work with, that make something really big that you know how it looks, even if you've never flown. So anyway, map crazies of the world unite. Okay, so where are the women now? All over the place. Here's proof. And I have to tell you, when I went to the AGU meeting about 10 years ago, I knew we had made it. First of all, there were a lot of men pushing strollers with babies while their women were doing their work. But also, there was a line in the ladies' room. Okay, so if you want to read about the excitement of the revolution, this is Naomi Oreskes' book. You can probably go to Amazon and just put in plate tectonics and Oreskes, O-R-E-S-K-E-S. It was published in 2003, and I have a chapter in there that kind of describes how just astonishing it was, and about the women's situation and this whole thing. And if you don't want to acquire a whole book, just email me. Here's my email address, and I have it right on my desktop. I'll send you the text, which was almost everything. Believe it or not, I hardly had a picture in there. Okay, then if you want to acquire a copy of my simulation of the plate tectonics, or the tutorial that went with it, email me. You can get a copy until they're all gone here. If you want to access the geoanimations, this is my website. The EMVC is the Educational Multimedia Visualization Center. It's, if you just Google Atwater Animations, there's a whole bunch of sites there that'll take you there. And on there, go to the download page, and there's dozens of animations of various things. I've shown you some of them. And use them any way you want. I just want to get them out there. Here's my website, my address. And if you just go to the geology department at UC Santa Barbara, you'll find it. That's it. Question?
I'd just like to make one comment. I love your animations, but I think they're a lovely example of mapping moving into the fourth dimension.
Exactly, exactly. I used to make, before we had computer animation, I used to make flip book pages, and all my publications were full of pages. And the moment I put them into the program and animated them, I discovered some of my mistakes. Because we have such an intuition about moving things. And I thought I was really good at that until I actually made them move. And they were pretty good. They were pretty good. But there's just a completely different insight we bring. Not all of it, of course, applies to things over millions of years, but there's really a lot that we've got. Yes?
We'll have here first, and then we'll...
Okay, you guys.
I wanted to mention, when you were saying, mapping is two-dimensional, but that's a kind of a historic thought on it, because if you notice, all of our children, we're all up in age here, but all of our children, and naturally, we all think in multiple dimensions. And so the area of the future, when I send stuff out, say, to a ship with the young 20-year-olds and 19-year-olds, and I want to talk about mapping, I have to do everything in animation and three-dimensional, and so that's where mapping, quote unquote, is going to the real world, as near to the real world as we think, and so we don't have to teach people to think in two dimensions anymore.
That's right. In GIS, it's n-dimensional. You can put any kind of data all in a stack and figure out how anything's related to anything else. It's just wonderful.
We're still looking at it in 2 dimensions on our screens.
That's right. And we're still telling stories in a line. I mean, I don't know how else to do it, but this new generation, they go on a website and there are 100 different directions you could take it, a bunch of different routes. It's a whole new way of thinking about things.
I was just going to comment that when I took Marie Tharp's oral history, she had discovered the 2 maps side by side of the seismic activity and the soundings, and just spoke to Bruce Heesen about that. Really, this old theory of plate tectonics, really, I think we've hit it. And he sat on that for 1.5 years before he would present it to the scientific community. Talk about a woman taking a back seat.
Yeah, I had some big arguments with him.
I'm sure.
But we brought him around.
Okay, there we go. I also like to mention with the 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional, there's a new tool out called Science on a Sphere. And it's an actual globe that's in a small room, and they have some amazing plate tectonics movies where you can see the past plate tectonics and also the future of what's going to happen in the next few million years. They're located at the NOAA headquarters. You can go there at lunchtime. They're at the library or the Natural History Museum here, and also at the zoo. So
this is a sphere that they project onto.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard about those. It sounds fantastic.
Oh, you've got one here. Oh, outstanding. My bad.
Yay.
Great.
I think it's lunchtime.
We will reconvene at 1:30 p.m.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.